Good morning, still. Thank you, Daniel, for the introduction. Indeed, ELNET and ELNET Israel is proud to co-host and sponsor this panel. I think that when we talk about terrorism and terrorism funding, it is definitely important to deal with the issue and the role of NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Of course, civil society is part of any democratic society, and NGOs have a very important role in expressing civil society, and we've seen it in Israel in recent months. However, as we know also, there's a gray zone in the role of NGOs in international relations. Not all of them deal exclusively with humanitarian issues, and as we know, the role of NGOs in international conflict is controversial both in democracies and in authoritarian regimes. Of course, in our dialogue and relation with our European friends and partners, there's no question that there should be no limitation to the freedom of action, the freedom of expression of NGOs, but there should be clarity. There should be clarity regarding their mandate, there should be clarity regarding their funding, and I think it is in the interest of all the actors. As we know, illiberal democracies and authoritarian regimes try to completely block the activities of NGOs, but in actual democracies, there's also a debate about the funding of NGOs, and there are in fact some restrictions, including in the US, including in Europe, including in Israel, on the funding, and that has to do with clarity. So on this, I'm happy to have our panel discuss this sensitive issues. And again, thank you, and looking forward to a very productive panel. Thank you.
And for NGO Monitor's President and co-founder, Professor Gerald Steinberg, please.
Good morning. I want to reiterate everything that Emmanuel said about the importance of civil society, but also raise some questions, continue to raise some questions. I think this is at least the 6th time that we have spoken on this topic at this conference. And over the years, while the evidence has accumulated, the responses have been slow. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about the responses. Civil society is very important, but when a large amount of funding, in this case, tens, hundreds of millions of dollars and euros, pounds, other forms of currency, go into terror entities on a regular basis. And Gaza is a terror entity. It is run by terror organizations. Afghanistan, there are many other places around the world. And there is an expectation, a moral expectation, a fundamental expectation that the donors, those who invoke the principles of humanitarian aid, and those are very central. There are large populations that are suffering. But there's also an obligation to make sure, to do the due diligence, to set up guidelines and implement them, to make sure that the money is not removed from the humanitarian purposes and given to those terrorist entities. When you have a place like Gaza, where almost nothing goes in, goes out, except for humanitarian aid, and the major industry in Gaza is producing missiles and rockets to shoot against Israel, where does that come from? Does it come from the pipes? Does it come from all the other materials that are ostensibly being imported for humanitarian purposes, for civilian purposes? And if that is the case, why is there so little oversight? There are a couple of relatively new developments that I want to briefly mention before our distinguished panel takes the floor. Over a year ago, the head of World Vision International, and particularly World Vision Australia's Gaza operation, Mohammed Halabi, was convicted in an Israeli court of siphoning off approximately $50 million in aid. There's a lot of controversy and a lot of criticism from people in Australia, particularly from the heads of World Vision in Australia, because they said the trial, because it involved terrorism, took place behind closed doors in Beersheba. What they do not and refuse to relate to is the open source information, particularly the internal contradictions, which shows the absence of due diligence. For the many years that World Vision Australia funded its operation in Gaza, the financial reports are entirely inconsistent that they provided. Just a very specific example, the World Vision set up a nonprofit in Israel, registered with the Israeli Register of Nonprofits. And when they submitted reports, the reports had a factor of almost between 5 and 10 more funding than what World Vision claimed it was providing in other reports. So obviously there's a contradiction. And yet they refused to deal with that, refused to discuss that, and appears to be there was no investigation. Very recently, the Jerusalem District Court officially closed that entity for failing to provide its legally obligated reports, financial reports, and other reports. And yet there's no response from World Vision Australia, no attempt to investigate what turns out to have been, according to very clear evidence, an abuse of their funds in a terror entity. Another major area that NGO Monitor has looked at, and the purpose of our organization is to do the research. And I would hope that governments would take this more seriously, and then we would have less of a responsibility, because it's almost impossible to follow all of this. We're talking about many, many organizations in many different funding sources. But the consistent pattern of funding for NGOs, ostensibly civil society organizations, that have very deep connections to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, that evidence is open source, and very public. When the Israeli government designated now 8 organizations of that group, and there are a number of other organizations in Gaza which have similar evidentiary patterns that the Israeli government did not designate, because they do not designate as prohibited entities organizations that are based in Gaza. But when we look at the overall pattern, we're talking about at least 12 organizations with at least 75 individuals that have been identified as being open source connected to the PFLP. The essential need for donors, whether they're governments or individuals, to examine where their money goes and to look at the evidence and not close their eyes and say, well, these are people that we work with, we trust them, they've been with us for many years. That's not an answer to the evidence. So I would hope that with discussions like this, there will be greater attention to the need for due diligence, particularly when we're dealing with non-governmental organizations that receive large amounts of money from foreign governments and from private foundations that are operating inside terror entities. I think that issue needs to have a lot more discussion and analysis, both in the academic world and in the governmental policy world, and I think the one place where it's done consistently is here at the ICT. So thank you very much for attending this panel, and I will now turn it over to, I guess you.
Now I'd like to invite our panelists to the stage. MP Theo Francken, the President of the Belgium delegation to NATO, Parliamentary Assembly, and former Secretary for Migration of Belgium. Ilit Ostrovitch-Levi, the Director General of Israel Money Laundering and Terror Financing Prohibition Authority of Israel. Dr. Einat Wilf, former MK and the Chair of Knesset Education Committee. And our moderator, Olga Deutsch, VP of NGO Monitor. Please.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Daniel, Emmanuel, and Gerald. And I'm Olga. It is a pleasure to meet you. And thank you for our distinguished panelists this morning. We don't have much time, but we are guaranteed an extremely interesting discussion this morning over, as you have already heard, something that is not an easy topic. The challenge that lays ahead of us is how do we, on one hand, ensure in democracies a thriving civil society, allow non-governmental organizations to do their job, promote human rights, sustainable developments, distribute humanitarian aid, while in a developed and challenging environment in which terror elements and radical agents are increasingly blurring the lines as we know them of what poses a threat in our contemporary societies, making sure that we do not allow radical elements to penetrate this work. And because we are so short of time, I will spare you my analysis and allow our panelists to share their views. So, Mr. Francken, let me start with you. As currently serving in the Belgian government, both as a member of the parliament on a national level, but also with your role at the NATO, right? It would be interesting to hear how do you think elected officials can grapple with this challenge of finding the line between identifying terror elements, even in those cases when we accidentally or not give them taxpayers' money also, because we believe that they are promoting human rights and humanitarian aid, while we want to make sure that they're not involved in terror attacks or radicalization, or as our previous speaker and expert called it, anti-constitutional delegitimization.
Yes, thank you, Olga. Thank you for the invitation as well, ELNET and NGO Monitor. I think that when we talk about the 22 years that we had after 9/11, we did a lot. Europe stood strong, stronger than ever, I think. And it was because we enhanced our cooperation with intelligence services worldwide, Western intelligence services, but also others. In Belgium, we had attacks a couple of years ago, but we avoided way more attacks because of the collaboration with Israel, with Morocco, with Turkey, and a lot of other intelligence services, and that's the way we have to go. I think when we talk about NGOs and monitoring NGOs, I think we need also firm intelligence. We work together, our services with your services, and on the accusations that we talk on the terrorist organization of Palestine, PLFP, we need to have fast and secure information and evidence. I think that's the most important. So yeah, we're subsidizing a lot of NGOs, Palestine NGOs, but it's not that we have, for the moment, real evidence that they're colluded with terrorist organizations. I think I just can ask you when you have that evidence, just give it to our secret service, to our intelligence services and our police, and we will act, because of course we have due diligence. I don't know where that's coming from. We have due diligence. We're working together with our intelligence services when we are talking about giving subsidies to NGOs worldwide. We're working in difficult places. We're working in Afghanistan. We keep on working in Afghanistan for women's rights, for children's rights, even after we withdraw from Afghanistan last year or 2 years ago. We have people working in ENABLE, who is like our development cooperation agency of Belgium. We have them working in Gaza. We have them working in Ramallah and other places here in Israel. So I can say that we try to control and do our best, because Belgium is not interested in giving money to terrorist organizations. That would be very, very stupid, I think, and it will not pass in our parliament, because who wants that? So, but there's also a bigger picture. When I see that we did a lot in the past 22 years, but we have 3 big challenges. Migration, we talked about that. I'm not going into that, but what we're doing with the illegal migration is totally naive. I was Minister for Migration for 4 years in Belgium, whilst the European migration crisis. It was just crazy what we did, and it keeps on going. We will have more than 1 million asylum requests in Europe, all to illegal migration coming through. We don't know who those Palestinians are, who those Afghans are. We don't know. We have no clue who those Somalians are. We are trying to vet them and control them, but 95% we don't even know who they are. So that's a big problem. Then we have the weakness of democracy. Democracy as a model is into fall. And that's a big challenge. That's a worldwide challenge, of course. And we'd have to try to give the good example and try to and just defend democracy as a model. And the third point is that we need unity of command. We don't have that. And I give you 4 examples. IRGC, European Parliament vote to put them on the terror list. They voted, majority. European Commission goes at the pledging of the oath of Raisi, the new president. Crazy. He was the head of diplomatic service of European Commission, was sitting there with the leaders of Hamas, of Islamic Jihad, of all the terrorist groups, of Hezbollah. It was awful to see that as a European citizen. Then you have France, who doesn't want them on the terror list, European terror list. Macron doesn't want RGC on European terror list. And Belgium, our government, I'm not into government, I'm in opposition. We're the biggest party, but we're in opposition, it's damaged. But we invite the mayor of Tehran in Brussels, Zakani, who is like one of the most cruel people of the regime in Tehran. So we don't have unity of command. Hezbollah, the political arm is prohibited in Germany and in the Netherlands, but not in France and in Belgium. The military arm, yes. But what is the difference between the military arm and the political wing? You can explain me that? I don't understand that. I don't see that. When we talk about Muslim Brotherhood, Muslim Brotherhood. We had Muslim Brotherhood. Macron prohibited the CCIF, Collectif contre l'Islamophobie en France, collective against Islamophobia in France, because they scapegoat Islamophobia. They use it as an instrument because, of course, nobody wants to be Islamophobic, you know. It's very smart for them. But it's very difficult for us to attack that because, yeah, then you're attacking all Muslims and we don't want that, no? So Macron prohibited it. And in Belgium, our government subsidized the CCIB, the Collectif contre l'Islamophobie en Belgique. And while it was prohibited in France, in Paris, they just created another one, the CCIE, like the Collectif contre l'Islamophobie en Europe, in Brussels. The same persons. Within a week, they did that. And they're not prohibited. So it's really, really sickening, and it's really dangerous. So there's no unity of command. And then finally, when we talk, of course, about Palestine and Israel, then they say, when we talk about Palestine, they say, yeah, but Israel, you know, there's a lot of people who are very, very critical on Israel, very critical on the way you treat Palestinian people, where you treat the conflict. So when I posted on Facebook the fact I'm here, I received a lot of reactions that they're saying, you're talking about you're going to speak about counter-terrorism in Israel? Please. They're not into that because they have to watch themselves and they have to give themselves some lessons about terrorism because like Israel is like a semi-terrorist state. You know that discourse of the left wing, it's very big in Europe. So that's also why I'm here, but I respond, don't worry, I respond, I defend my position. I'm absolutely 100% congruent, and I'm proud to be here, and I'm very proud to have this invitation. But I have to really defend the fact I'm just here as an MP of Belgium. So, yeah, it's difficult, and that's are the 3 big weaknesses after 22 years. And we have to tackle that, defending democracy, having unity of command towards RGC, Iran, Hezbollah, and everything, and stop illegal migration, going for the Australian model, just closing the asylum guichets in Europe, closing them down all, and stop that. We're not stopping migration, of course, And a lot of people are with good intentions, but some have bad intentions, and we don't know who are the good and who are the bad. So that's a big problem. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We were supposed to be joined also by a member of the European Parliament, Mr. Lopez-Isturiz, who is also the head of the delegation to Israel of the European Parliament, but due to the devastating floods in Spain, he was forced to stay put, but he was kind enough to send a short video message, which we would like to share with you this morning, because the EU perspective on this issue is crucial given its role on the old continent.
Hello and good morning. I'm sorry that I was not able to join you in Herzliya today. I would like, first of all, to thank Professor Boaz Ganor, Shabtai Savit and Professor Uriel Reichman for organizing this summit, and a special thanks to my friends Daniel Shadmy and Matthias Schussler from ELNET for their kind invitation. I'm afraid to miss today's discussion because I must attend an extraordinary executive board meeting of my party in Madrid. For those of you who do not know me, I'm a Spanish politician that unfortunately I have suffered in my life terrorism. Also, as you know, in my country for certain years we suffered, the impact of terrorism. So I'm not the classical European politician, maybe a little bit naive about these things. On the contrary, many of you have to know you can count on me for the fight of the eradication of terrorism. Whatever is religious, political, regional, whatever you want to say it, I am there to fight this and to help all of you also from the European Parliament, from European politics, and especially my good friends in Israel that are suffering on a daily basis this. They know that they can count with me. Precisely as President of the Delegation for Relations with Israel and member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs in the European Parliament, I take great interest in the security of the State of Israel and Israel's right to defend itself against who attack its sovereignty. These are significant times in the relationship between the European Union and Israel. I am concerned by reports of foreign NGO procurement of EU funds that end up supporting illicit terrorist activities. This obscure funding and its links to terrorism should be a great concern in the European-Israeli relation, as both partners manage to contain not only the terrorist threat, but also to protect democratic institutions and stability, both in the European Union and in Israel. We should jointly oppose the legitimization of radical ideologies to advance the security of both of our regions and to preserve democratic foundations. It is important to highlight the work of NGO Monitor Research and ELNET to continue identifying abuse in development aid and to stop funding terrorist organizations that threaten Israel. If we sever the connections between funding from the EU institutions and terrorist organizations, we will take a huge step forward in increasing our security both in the EU and in Israel. Please rest assured that in the European Parliament, my colleagues and I will remain vigilant so our EU financial support contributes to peace, stability, democracy, and strengthened cooperation between the European Union and the only democracy in the Middle East. I wish all of you, participants in this important summit, great discussions and exchanges. Thank you very much.
Important remarks. Thank you. Einat, to you, as as a former member of the Knesset in Israel, so someone who was actively involved in drawing policies here, but also as a distinguished researcher and author on this issue, I would appreciate if you could shed a little bit more light on this rather unique intersection between political advocacy and radical terror elements when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We don't see this that often in other conflict-ridden areas. It is interesting probably for the audience just to provide a broader context in as short of a speech as possible, that most of the non-governmental organizations that research, publicly available research shows have ties to designated terror organizations are also the most active in what, again, our previous speaker called anti-constitutional delegitimization work. Al-Haq, for example, one of the leading Palestinian human rights organizations, NGOs, who was one of the designated NGOs by Israel for its reported ties to a designated terror organization, PFLP, also filed over 20 submissions to the International Criminal Court in The Hague against Israel, trying to make a legal case that Israel is an apartheid racist endeavor. Could you share your view on this and how Knesset and other policymakers can address this?
Certainly, thank you.
In a few minutes.
Certainly, thank you. Basically, this is a feature of the Palestinian struggle from day one. It's all one thing. There's no separation. And sometimes you hear among Palestinian speakers when there are efforts, for example, to make boycotting Israel illegal. So then they would say, you're even making boycotting illegal. You're not leaving us any legitimate means of conducting our struggle. Even the non-violent means are illegitimate to you. What are you leaving us with? And my answer is always, the problem was never with the means of the Palestinian struggle. The problem was and remains with the ends. Terrorism is a means of trying to achieve a goal. Had the Palestinian goal been an independent state, ending the occupation, having better conditions, I would even say fine. But the problem is that that has never been their goal, not for a single moment. The Arab-Palestinian struggle from day one, from more than 100 years ago, was a battle against Zionism in any way, shape, or form. It was a battle against the idea that the Jews as a people have the equal right to self-determination in any part, in any borders, in any amount of territory in this land. And for this goal, they have mobilized over the past century invading armies, economic boycotts, terrorism, international condemnations, legal battles. All of these are ultimately means in a single battle with a single goal. So the effort to separate it, the effort to say, this Palestinian activity is legitimate, but this Palestinian activity is illegitimate because it's terrorist. It actually doesn't work that way in the Palestinian context. The book that I wrote on the War of Return looks at the biggest funding of the West and the EU to UNRWA, which is supposedly just for schooling, but it is fundamentally funding the vision of the Palestinians that Israel is a temporary aberration in the region that will ultimately disappear. So when Europeans give money, when they feel really good about, I've met so many European diplomats who feel so good about funding Palestinians for humanitarian, for civil society. They really pat themselves on the shoulder for those funding because it's not terrorism. But they don't understand that in this funding, they're providing much coveted European and Western legitimacy for the Palestinian vision that a Jewish state in any borders is illegitimate, that they possess the absolute non-existent idea of a right of return into the sovereign state of Israel, that Israel is an apartheid, terrorist, illegitimate state, and therefore should not exist. This is all of one thing. And anyone who tries to pick apart and say, this part is okay, but this part is not okay, is ultimately missing the bigger picture of how the Palestinians have been conducting their still happily failed struggle for their last century by trying, by any means possible, to mobilize against Zionism. So when they come and tell you, this is humanitarian, this is civil society, this is nonviolent, the question should never be about the means. Terrorism or not terrorism, that's not what's important. The question should be, what is your purpose? What is your vision? This money that we're giving to you, at the end of this money, is there a Jewish state anywhere between the river and the sea? And if the answer is not a resounding, clear yes, then no money should be given, regardless of how the organization operates. If Europe and the West are truly believers, and as I am, that ultimately the best, and I think the only way for the two peoples to live here is as sovereign people in two separate states, one of those states has to be Jewish. And if the Arab and Palestinian vision continues to be that a Jewish state is illegitimate, that Zionism is a toxic, racist, terrorist, apartheid idea, then no money of any kind should flow to them.
Thank you, Einat. Ilit, to you now. I mean, we tend to believe that that this convergence or intersection between the political advocacy of these groups and, in certain cases, their affiliation to terror organizations is unique to our context. But the expert on this topic and a representative of the drafting policy of the Israeli government is with us, thankfully, on the panel today. And I learned, as we prepared for this panel, that this is actually a topic that many, many governments are grappling with. How do we, on one hand, make sure that we do not impose restrictive anti-NGO legislations and guidelines, right, that would restrict their operations, particularly in conflict-ridden areas, where they can serve very, very important partners, but at the same time not miss out on those cases in which terror elements or radical elements are clearly abusing somewhat, I would say, vulnerable structures, right? Because as opposed to governmental agencies and as opposed to the private sector where the legislation is clear and the rules to the game or the market are very, very clear to everyone, when it comes to the civil society, we don't have the same vetting procedures and we don't have the same demand for transparency and accountability in place. So we would appreciate if you would give us a top-down view on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to come and discuss this highly important issue. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, the global organization that's setting the global standards for money laundering. So 34 years ago, the G7 countries founded this important organization in Paris, coming from the notion, the understanding that for an effective fight of crime, organized crime, and drug dealing, it's not just worthwhile to chase the criminals and the drugs, but rather follow the money and actually disrupt the funding channels of the crime and the organized crime in order to effectively enforce and avoid these crimes. And it was only a decade, approximately even more than a decade, I'm sorry, afterwards, after the horrifying September 11 attacks, that the global leadership came to understanding that in the same manner of effectively enforcing against crime by the money laundering regime that we're all aware of today, there should be also a terrorism financing regime, and the organization founded and declared the standards, the global standards to fight terrorism by following the money. We heard about the goal, the end goal of the money, but in order to understand the end goal of the money, we have to follow the money. And I'm here in a double capacity because on the one hand, I'm in the capacity of as the head of the FIU, the Financial Intelligence Unit, Israel FIU, IMPA. And on the other hand, IMPA is the national leader of the money laundering and terrorism financing regime. And only after realizing that in order to effectively fight terrorism, we have to fight terrorism financing by following the money, the FATF and the governments worldwide started to address the idea, the issue of funding terrorism with NPOs. Either purposely and knowingly using NPOs or NPOs that being exploited for that matter. And when we talk about using NPOs to finance terrorism, we mainly talk about it in the context of designations by the UN Council, because many times terrorists are trying to circumvent their fund, to channel the money to places where devastating thing happens, vulnerable communities, war zone, very people in need, and they're trying to channel the funds over there in order to circumvent those designations and try to avoid them. And the method of using NPOs for the purpose of raising and transferring and eventually dispensing funds is very well evidenced worldwide. ISIL is doing that, Al-Qaeda is doing that, Hamas is doing that. Many organizations that work on the ground of Israel are doing that. We have, we know a very famous case of the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brothers, which you mentioned. I'm not sure the professional term, Muslim movement, I think that is. And we're very well aware of the method of using NPOs in order to fund and finance terrorism. However, and there is however, it is clear that in the same manner that most financial services and most legal entities are not aimed to launder money, most NPOs are not aimed to finance terrorism. And we must remember that most NPOs, many NPOs, I'm not sure if I can say most, but many NPOs are aimed for legitimate purpose, and there is and some of them are doing a very important work for the community and the social, and we must keep that in mind. In general, we, the FATF, the governments, are trying to promote a risk-based approach. The risk-based approach says there is no one blanket to cover all NPOs. Some NPOs, different NPOs are facing different risks, different level of risks, and in many cases, many governments are taking advantage of the FATF standards in order to prevent from legitimate NPOs to operate, and I'm not talking about NPOs in a specific field of operation, but rather NPOs and NGOs in general. So during the recent years, the FATF has been considering those unintended and unwanted consequences, and it is currently considered changes to its standards in order to make sure that the appropriate measures are being taken by the global community to use the justified counterterrorism financing regime against NPOs in the right manner and in the right circumstances. The way to do it is basically to raise awareness. It is easier said than done, of course, but governments and countries must develop methodologies for risk assessment. Also, the private sector must do that. We in INPA, we already we ran a national process, we call it the National Risk Assessment, in order to rank the risk of NPOs for both money laundering and terrorism financing. We do a strategic work and we publish strategic papers for the financial sector. The financial sector is a key factor here in order to be able to effectively manage the risk and fight terrorism financing where appropriate. We conduct what we call the projector summits in order to highlight subject in high risk, and we just recently conducted such summit in the field of using NPOs for terrorism financing. And of course, technological manners, there are many technological manners that they exist with the help of those technological tools, with a better framework of transparency, like beneficial ownership framework that we're currently trying to develop in the State of Israel, and close domestic and international cooperation. We have intelligence, we transfer the intelligence, we have a very close cooperation with many countries, including Belgium. We share this information regarding NPOs that deal with terrorism financing. We know the way to spot them from the information and the intelligence we receive from the financial sector, and we share this information with other countries, and we receive very valuable information from other countries. So again, we must manage the risk to be able to stop those who promote and finance terrorism while we promote the important work that other NPOs do.
Thank you very much. Obviously, it is a topic we could spend many, many more minutes discussing, but our time is short this morning. So I think that to what you said, that the main way of dealing with this or addressing is raising awareness, this panel is doing a pretty good job. So on that note, I want to thank the panelists and everyone in the audience for joining us in this not so easy discussion.